In a city that stages itself as glamorous, Mira, a quietly determined woman who prefers plain tea, stained dresses, and strong, honest words, walks into an exclusive boutique searching for a dress for her niece's wedding and is brusquely expelled because she doesn't fit. The humiliation cracks open a life she has been quietly building with her billionaire husband. Adrian hail a marriage of contrasts where adoration and misunderstanding live in the same house. An hour after the incident, Adrian's black SUV arrives, and with it a reckoning. The story follows Mira's inward and outward transformation as she confronts class prejudice, reclaims dignity, and forces the man who has loved and sheltered her to learn how to truly protect and respect her. Through vivid scenes, natural dialogue, and charged silences, the narrative explores ambition, power, vulnerability, and the quiet courage of choosing oneself. The boutique's windows were all glass and reputation, a hard, gleaming understatement against the rain-slicked boulevard. Inside, mannequins pose with practiced indifference, sunlight filtered in, as if pre-filtered for the sort of faces who came to be seen. Mira had come for a dress she did not want, in the way you sometimes go to borrow a stranger's umbrella because you forgot your own. Out of necessity, not vanity. Her niece's wedding had been moved forward. Family reasons. The invitation had been a soft rectangle of cream paper, routed through a cousin who kept track of names and obligations like a ledger. "You must come," the cousin had written. "Please do not wear that old kurta, Mira." So she came. She had worn, as she always did, what felt like her skin, a faded cotton salwar, its dye smudged at the hem, sleeves rolled to the elbows, because she did not know how to hold her hands like a woman who needed them pressed together. Her coat, heavy with drizzle, smelled faintly of cumin and rain. Her hair, pinned in a utilitarian bun, had not been given the consideration of a salon visit. She was not invisible. Exactly? Cities do not permit that. But in the boutique she felt thin at the edges, like a note that might be skipped over. "Madam?" The saleswoman's voice had the precise posture of someone trained to not breathe on money. "Can I?" "I need a dress," Mira said. Her voice was grainy, used to giving instructions to a husband who liked plainness in the morning and detail in the afternoon, to a niece who preferred silk, something simple. Not expensive. The saleswoman's smile tightened. "We have the perfect piece for you," she said, and the words slid past Mira like wind. The small sale of an exchange followed. Fitted measurements, the possibility of a private fitting room, credit cards. Mira's fingers fumbled for the cousin's recommendation, a color that was not festive, but respectable. When she told the woman she would pay in cash, pockets of small bills, the inheritance of thrift. There was the first small error, as if one had ticked a wrong box. A manager appeared then, a tall woman in an ivory coat who moved with the quick, exacted decisiveness of someone who ran more than a store. Her name was Celeste, and she wore the city's approval like a second skin. She looked at Mira the way people look at broken porcelain. Curious, then regretful for the object itself. "Madam," Celeste said, less a greeting than a sorting. "I'm sorry, but this is an appointment-only day. Our clients require discretion." Amira blinked. "I can make an appointment. Today is fully booked." Celeste's eyes slid to the coat, the shoes. "And, if I may be frank, please," Mira said, "just let me see something. I will not take long." "It's not about time." Celeste smiled as if smiling were a ribbon used to tie explanation onto the wind. "It's about atmosphere. I won't be able to." She had already turned away. There was an awkwardness to the doorway, a gap shaped by privilege. A group at a mirror laughed with the sort of ease that comes from being insulated. Mira could feel the muscles in her jaw tighten, like a string you pull before releasing a kite. She reached for the handle of the door with the steady, ordinary motion of someone who had always had to handle things herself. "You know what?" Celeste called, loud enough that the laughter paused. We don't cater to. The sentence hovered. It did not complete itself with words that would be politely unacceptable. Instead, it left the shape of them for everyone to fill in. The saleswoman by the mirror did the task willingly. Not everyone, she said, as if passing a baton. A small, private silence pressed against Mira's ribs. Mira felt heat creep up her neck. It was not anger so much as a sensation that the world had tilted. For a moment she thought of walking out, of returning to the steady, unshowy life she and Adrian had built, where their choices had more to do with comfort than the fashions of an unkind city. But in the moment between hurt and retreat, she saw the face of her niece, 15 and earnest, who needed an aunt who would not yield to humiliation. She forced her shoulders back. "Is that why?" a voice said behind her. It was not loud, but it had weight. Because of her appearance. Mira turned. A man stood near the rack of scarves, hands folded, a look that suggested the habit of watching things and making decisions quietly. He was a customer, ordinary seeming, the sort who would always buy something for a child's birthday and be forgiven for it, because he had the time. His hair was peppered and his coat was good. He watched the scene with the kind of attention Mira had not expected from strangers. Celeste's smile did not falter. "We have a clientele to consider." "You have a conscience to consider?" the man said. "Or maybe only the mirror?" The shop's atmosphere shuddered. The ladder at the mirror faded. Celeste's mouth worked as if she intended to reply, then chose retort. "I'm not sure who you are too." "I'm a customer," he said, "and I'm ashamed to be one right now." He turned then, picked up a scarf with small, exact hands, and walked to the counter. For a heartbeat the boutique unfroze, rearranged, as the scent of money and opinion swirled like perfume. Mira, who had anticipated the worst, a public shaming, a dismissal, found herself oddly, unexpectedly grateful for a stranger's small rebellion. She shook her head and prepared to leave. Outside, the rain had thickened, the sky holding its breath. Myra stood under the eaves with her bag heavy at her arm. Her fingers had gone cold. She had not expected the city to cut her in half like this, to demand she become smaller so the rest of it might feel larger. On the pavement a taxi rolled by, its windows steamed. Mira thought of home, of Adrian in his study, fingers worrying a silver fountain pen as he kept his calendars like landscapes. She thought of the quiet house, the small garden box where she grew chilies, the way their life had been stitched from different fabrics and frequently tugged by friction. She had married him because, in the smallness of ordinary days, he had offered an unforced warmth. Love had begun like a lantern placed on a threshold. It had not always been a torch. She stood for a long minute, imagining the things she would say in the privacy of their car. Reproaches she would keep to herself, the need for him to be protective in a way she hadn't demanded. A woman walked by, her heels loud, and Mira felt suddenly absurd. A woman with good manners can be dismissed for being ordinary in the place where only extraordinary things are allowed. An hour later, as dusk began to compress the city into shadows, a black SUV eased up to the boutique's curb. It did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived with the discreet competence of something that always knows where to be. Mira turned, so used to the rhythms of the street that she did not at first note who stepped from the vehicle. It was only when the heavy door opened and a man in a dark suit offered his arm in perfect deference that the world arranged itself into clarity. Adrian Hale looked like the certainty of geography. Mountainous, unmistakable. He was taller than most men, but not by theatrical design. He wore his wealth like grammar quietly, without the need to emphasize. People in the street looked away, because the sight of him asked for judgment they could not give. His hair was brushed back, eyes that had been built for attention scanning the boutique as if he had been following a map only he could read. He saw Mira first and his face shifted, as if a line had been redrawn on it, to admit a private light. For a moment he looked younger, shaved of his usual hesitation, and when he spoke his voice folded into the space between them like a familiar shawl. Mira. She did not touch him. The SUV's door was still open, the city hummed in the background like a repeated chord. "You shouldn't have come," she said, heat still at the back of her throat. He laughed, a small thing without triumph. "I came because of you," he said. And that was true, and it did not explain the trouble. Celeste appeared then, a flash of white coat and a tilt in the chin, more offended by his intersection with the boutique's curated geometry than by what had happened. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice was a careful, constructed thing. "A pleasure. We have a strict policy about—" "You have a policy about what?" Adrian asked. He did not so much demand answers as peel them back with the patient skill of someone who runs large meetings and often unravels quieter irritations. His gaze rested on Mira, and for a moment Mira saw the man who had, months earlier, sat in the kitchen with a mug of tea and taught her how to pronounce the name of a novel's heroine. He looked at her now as if he wanted to make the ground of her life as safe as he could. "This is a private appointment day," Celeste repeated. "We are careful to offer our clients privacy." "You are careful about what your clients look like," Adrian said. There was an almost operatic pause, the kind of silence on which reputations hang. Celeste's jaw tightened. "Sir," she began. The word was polite as a medical instrument. "Sir," Adrian echoed, amused and cool as a stone. "You are in business. I'm not here to involve the press. I simply asked to see your garments, to inquire about a purchase." He turned to Mira then, lifting his hand as if escorting her into a theater. "Would you like to go in?" Myra could hear the tiny thud in her chest, the old reflex of worry that came when she navigated spaces where money and manners were married. She wanted, in that breath, to refuse. She wanted to tell Adrian that his arrival felt like a flare, like the wrong kind of rescue. She wanted him to understand that sometimes humiliation was private and needed to be soothed in private. But the woman's lips were pressed into an exact line, and Mira saw in Adrian's expression an emotion she had not asked for but which settled her not ownership but solidarity. "Okay," she said, "one moment. Just to look." Inside, the boutique smelled of citrus and fabric softener, everything arranged like a well-constructed sentence. Adrian moved with a quality that was at once foreign and insistently familiar. He selected, held, and asked reasonable questions. Celeste, for her part, recovered her trained composure and guided them through racks, as if leading a film set. The staff, who had been a chorus of disapproval an hour earlier, now performed their roles with manufactured warmth. It was the most common magic of the wealthy, the ability to calibrate attention with currency. But Mira did not let the arrangement close around her. She watched Adrian as one watches a cartographer at work. Hands graceful, decisions quiet, and felt a complicated tenderness. He was always like this, in public, precise, measured, protective, the man she had fallen in love with in part, because he translated uncertainty into actionable plans. At home, he would touch her hand with the gentleness of a person who was working on unraveling knots inside someone else. In the boutique, his touch was an arrow. They moved to a private dressing room. Adrian waited outside the curtains like a sentry, respectful as a man who had learned the etiquette of space. Myra changed into the dress he had chosen, an understated number the color of soft earth. It fit like a promise. She looked at herself in the mirror and did not recognize the sharpness that the boutique's light gave her. She looked more like someone being examined than someone living. She felt a twinge, not quite discomfort, more the sharpness of a borrowed shape. When she emerged, Celeste rose as if called upon by the part of herself that wanted Mira's approval, even while she had refused it. She managed a commentary about the fabric, its provenance, the care one must take. "We could also offer tailoring," she said, hands fluttering. To make it more perfect, Adrian supplied. He had never been patronizing. His tone was even, not unkind. She is not a project, Celeste. Celeste blinked, then laughed, an awkward sound. Of course, Mira felt, for the second time that day, the pressure of being small in the face of a world designed to make people feel small. She could have let Adrian's presence be the answer. He could have, with a flick of a pen, made Celeste's boutique the place where every member of the family took orders and where Mira herself would never need to be seen in a marketplace of judgment. But being married to a billionaire did not mean leaving the world to be rearranged by the stroke of someone else's wealth. Her marriage had been built on quieter foundations: respect, a careful negotiation of autonomy, and the way Adrian had once left a note in her purse. A list of things he loved, written in his neat hand, on a day when she had been frightened of her own capacity. "Adrian," she said, softly. "Thank you, but I don't want you to fix this for me." He blinked. There was a brief confusion, an almost painful recalculation. "You don't?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. His mind had been trained to fix almost everything that was broken around him, with teams, with lawyers, with white-gloved suits. People had come to expect miracles in his wake. "No," Mira said, and she tasted the word as if it were a citrus pit, bitter and clean. "I want you to stand with me. Not in front of me. Not to be my armor. With me. If you love me, then be my equal in this. Let us both be seen together." Adrian's face softened, and in that softening something old and lovely in him came forward. The man who had once learned to fold an origami bird to show her how dedication looks. "I can be with you," he said. "I can do that." They left the boutique together without spending a rupee, the purchased dress left like an offering undone. On the sidewalk, under the umbrella of Adrian's body, Mira felt again the city's breath, hot, restless, inquisitive. People glanced as they passed and arranged the story in their heads: the billionaire and his pretty wife, the woman who had been escorted, the mercies of money. The street had resumed its indifferent rhythm, and with it the ordinary cruelty of everyday anonymity. At home, the house smelled of jasmine and paper, the study's windows opened to the drumming rain. Adrian poured tea as if it were an ancient ceremony. He asked a lot of small questions. What the woman's name had been, precisely what she had said, questions that were not meant to demand answers, but to build a map of the day. Mira watched him, and in the watching she uncovered an old ache. Marital complacency had crept in somewhere between their calendars and their commutes. He loved her, it was true, but comfort had sometimes been confused with intimacy. He had been generous in flights and in finance, in gestures that kept the world at bay, while he made appointments to keep it at bay further. But the small daily acts of solidarity that stitch a life together, those had sometimes been left to her. This was about class, Mira said, stirring her tea with a spoon that sounded metallic in the hush. Not fashion. Adrian sat back. "I know," he said. "I should have. You shouldn't have done anything rash." Mira interrupted lightly. "You should have been there. You should have known." He looked at her as if trying on her words for size, then nodded slowly. "I didn't know," he said, as if that was a confession. "That's not the same thing." Her voice was not sharp. It was made of the plain timbre of someone who had used it for years. "But you can learn. We can make it a practice. If I get the indignity, you don't fix it for me, Adrian. You make the world stop and listen, with me in the center." He reached for her hand and held it like someone measuring the width of a room. "Teach me," he said. "Show me how." So she did. Over the following weeks, the boutique episode unspooled into the small curriculum of their marriage. They talked about money and manners in the evenings, about what it meant to be powerful in a city that disguised hierarchy as taste. Adrian listened, sometimes with the blind astonishment of a man discovering a new continent close to home. He learned the names of people Mira admired: widows who taught weaving, grocers who gave credit to those in need, teachers who spent their salaries on children's stationery. He learned to consider how his presence altered rooms and how to use it differently. He wrote checks with care, not as absolution, but as a tool. He stopped assuming that his wealth was the default answer and started asking questions instead. Mira, meanwhile, found that humiliation had a peculiar alchemy. When faced with dignity, it could harden into something like resolve. She remembered small slights from her childhood that had shaped her posture like a fault line. She rewove those memories into the present, not by erasing the past but by naming it. She began to volunteer at a community center where women learned to sew and sell. She taught them the unshowy craft of pricing, the art of measuring fabric so it would not be ruined by cheapness. She would sit with them and stitch, and the act of making something from nothing, the slow, patient alchemy of needle and thread, became a daily sermon. Adrian attended once, feeling awkward in a room that had not been constructed for his kind. He sat at a table with women whose hands told stories of long days. They watched him, and he watched him. And when he spoke, it was with the humility of someone who had been made slightly smaller by an idea. He listened to their talk of credit and of markets, of the boutique, and of the men who made decisions in tempered rooms. As Mira watched him, she saw the lines of his face shift. He had trouble with simple humility because so much of his life had been built on commanding rooms. But there, under the fluorescent light of the community center, he practiced listening with a patience that was almost holy. Relationships shift slowly, like tectonic plates pushed by unseen forces. For Mira and Adrian, the change was not dramatic. No sudden dissolution or honeymoon occurred. Instead, something gentler and truer. They began to calibrate their power. They started to host evenings where different worlds could meet. A magistrate and a seamstress, a minister and a store owner, where conversations were engineered to resist the easy seduction of rank. One such evening turned into a small coalition. Some boutique managers agreed to offer a free day for underprivileged women. A small coalition of philanthropists agreed to fund a modest micro-loan program for tailors. A fashion blogger agreed to feature the work of women from the community center. Celeste, for her part, remained a study of contradictions. She wrote Adrian an email, polite, stiff, about the inappropriateness of certain public displays. Mira, who had not wanted spectacle, did not respond publicly. Instead, she reached out privately to a junior staff member in the boutique, a girl who had been there the day she was expelled and who had cried when Celeste's sharpness became more than policy. Mira offered her a cup of tea and the chance to learn at the community center, a soft but potent gesture that did more than an angry speech ever could. The climax of their small campaign came not with scandal, but with a slow, public perfumption, an article in a weekend magazine, one that liked to label human interest as a kind of moral weather report, ran a piece about the initiative. It was not a story of a billionaire who rescued a poor wife, and nor was it a tale of humiliation redeemed by money. It was, instead, a portrait of several women who, having been told they were less than, were forced to decide whether to accept a smaller life. One of them was Mira. The author had come to the community center and sat in on a sewing class and learned how much courage goes into measuring accurately. The piece folded Adrian's name into it like an afterthought, a fact rather than a headline. He read it with Mira on the couch. Their feet tangled, and both of them cried at different parts. Adrian at the injustice recounted with calm, Mira at the ordinariness of days that finally mattered. The real climax, though, was quieter. It happened in front of the boutique, months after the rain dampened day. A small group of women from the community center, wearing garments they had designed themselves, skirts patterned with the kind of confidence that marks a craftsperson, walked into Celeste's shop with appointment slips in hand. They were there to be measured, fitted, and perhaps refused. Celeste greeted them with the trained composure she reserved for runway-ready clientele. The junior staffer, now learning to measure and price at the center, stood at the counter, steady as a small post. Celeste looked at Mira as she entered. Mira in a dress that was modest and perfectly cut, with sleeves rolled because she liked those sleeves. There was a history between them that did not go away. Celeste opened her mouth, then closed it. The boutique's mirror no longer reflected social lines with the certainty it once had. Customers watched as the ritual of exclusion faltered under the weight of people who refused to be small. The manager's voice found a new path. She offered an awkward apology to no one and a polite welcome to many. There was no trumpeting of victory. Life rarely offers such orchestral endings, but there was, in the quiet minutes that followed, a reshaping of the city's geometry, a small, stubborn shift in where dignity lived. Mira walked out of the boutique that day feeling the worth of her own step. Adrian's SUV waited, black and patient as a shadow. He opened the door for her in the civility they had learned together, an echo of the man who had once matched his favorite pen's ink to her handwriting. He did not call her his trophy or his rescue. He called her by her name and asked, gently, how she wanted to spend the afternoon. She smiled. It was not triumphal, it was a soft, lived thing. Let's go to the market, she said. I want to buy chilies. He laughed and drove them to the stall where an old man still traded in time and dexterity, and where the price of a dozen chilies could be negotiated like the terms of a small treaty. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the crowd, two people who had chosen and were still choosing what it meant to love across differences. Their hands brushed when they reached for the same bunch, and they let it happen, without ownership and without apology. As the sun tilted and the city unfolded its evening like a garment, Mira knew humiliation would lurk again. Human life had a habit of returning stings for its own sustenance. But she also knew how to meet it now, with a voice that would not be quieted, with a husband who had been taught to listen rather than fix, and with a patchwork of women who would measure and mend together. Power, she had learned, did not have to be a thing that silenced others. It could be a tool to widen rooms. When at night she placed her hand over the small scar on Adrian's palm, the faint mark from a childhood bicycle fall, she felt the rhythm of their life, the complicated, ordinary music of two people learning to turn courtesy into solidarity. The black SUV remained, sometimes necessary, sometimes conspicuous, but never again the only answer. And the boutique, its windows still glass and reputation, found, in the slow course of things, a way to fit more people through the door.